The day I came home from the hospital with my son, I stood on my in-laws' front porch for 11 minutes. I counted. I know because I kept checking my phone, hoping the next buzz would be them unlocking the door. It never came. My mother-in-law had seen me through the glass panel beside the door. I know she did. She turned away. That was the moment I understood that the life I thought I had built was never really mine. My name is Paige. I'm 31 years old, and I grew up in Oakville, Ontario, in one of those neighborhoods where the houses all look the same, and everybody waves at each other from driveways, but nobody actually knows what's happening inside. My parents were the kind of couple who could throw a perfect dinner party and then not speak to each other for 3 days afterward. I learned early that appearances were the currency in our house. Keep smiling. Don't make it awkward. Whatever you do, don't embarrass the family. I married my husband Noah when I was 27. He was charming in that easy, effortless way that makes you think someone is simpler than they actually are. He had this laugh that filled a room, and he always knew exactly what to say at the right moment. His parents, Gordon and Maureen, lived 40 minutes away in Burlington, and from the very beginning they were involved in everything. Every holiday, every decision, every conversation that should have just been between the two of us, somehow circled back to what his mother thought. I told myself it was fine. That's what you do when you love someone. You absorb the things that bother you and you keep moving. We'd been married 3 years when I got pregnant. It wasn't planned, but it wasn't unwanted either. I remember sitting in the bathroom at 6 in the morning, looking at that test, and feeling something that I can only describe as terrified hope. I wanted it to be the thing that finally brought us closer together. I wanted it to matter in a way that made everything else make sense. Noah's reaction was hard to read. He smiled, said the right things, held me, but something behind his eyes had shifted and I couldn't name it. I told myself I was overthinking. Pregnant women overthink. That's normal. The pregnancy was hard. I had severe morning sickness that lasted well into my second trimester, and I was working full-time as a project coordinator at a logistics firm in Mississauga. My commute alone was 90 minutes, each way. I was exhausted in a way I had never been before. The kind of tired that lives in your bones. And through all of it, Noah was increasingly absent. Late nights at work. Weekends where he was physically present but mentally somewhere else entirely. Whenever I tried to talk about it, he'd say I was emotional, and that the stress of the pregnancy was making me see problems that weren't there. I started to believe him. That's the part I hate the most. I actually started to believe him. 7 months in, I fell. I know it sounds like nothing. People fall all the time. But I was coming down the stairs in our house in the early morning. Noah had already left, or so I thought, and I missed the last 2 steps and went down hard. I landed on my side, not my stomach, and the baby was fine. I was fine. But I lay there on the floor of our hallway for a moment, just staring at the ceiling, and the first thought I had wasn't about the fall. It was, why does it feel like I'm always catching myself alone? The baby came 6 weeks later, healthy. 8 pounds, 1 ounce, a boy. I called him Theo. Wait, no. I named him James. That was the name I had chosen long before Noah had any input. He'd wanted something else, something that sounded more like his side of the family, but I held that line. James, my grandmother's maiden name. The only piece of something truly mine that I could give him. The delivery was complicated. I ended up needing an emergency C-section, and the recovery was rougher than I expected. By the time I was stable, and James was settled in the NICU for monitoring, he was fine, just precautionary. I was exhausted and shaking, and I needed someone there with me. Noah came, stayed for a few hours, and then said he had something to handle. He'd be back, he promised. He came back the next morning. I didn't ask what he'd been doing. I didn't have the energy. I just held my son through the plastic panel of the incubator and I talked to him. I told him about the house we would make a home. About the street we'd walk down in autumn when the maples turned. About all the things I was going to do right. 2 days later, the doctors said James and I could go home. I called Noah to come and pick us up. He answered on the 4th ring and said he was stuck in a meeting, but his mother could come. I said fine. I said fine because what else was I going to say? His mother arrived with a tight smile and a car seat she'd bought without asking me what kind I wanted. She drove in silence, and when I mentioned that I'd need help for the first few weeks, just someone nearby just in case, she said, we'll see how things go. That was all. When we pulled into their driveway in Burlington instead of ours in Oakville, I assumed we'd made a stop. Then she said, I thought it made more sense for you to stay here for a bit while you recover. Nobody had asked me. Nobody had mentioned it. I said I'd rather go home. She said the house was a mess, and Noah had been swamped, and it wasn't the right environment for a newborn. I said it was my home. She looked at me through the rearview mirror and said, "Let's just get inside, Paige." Inside, Gordon was in the living room watching the news. He nodded when I came in. Didn't get up. Noah's younger sister was in the kitchen, and she glanced at James with curiosity but didn't come closer, like he was something that required observation from a safe distance. I sat down on their couch with my newborn son, and I have never felt more alone in a room full of people. That night, I asked Maureen directly, could they help me get home, or at least stay with me at our place while I got on my feet? She said it wasn't a good time. Gordon had his physiotherapy appointments, she had her book club commitments, and Noah, she reminded me gently, was under enormous pressure at work. I asked what kind of pressure. She said, things you don't need to worry about right now. I was 24 hours post-C-section, breastfeeding a newborn, and the people who were supposed to be my family were telling me not to worry. I called my own parents that night from the bathroom, door locked, voice low so James wouldn't wake. My mother answered and I told her everything, trying to keep the shake out of my voice. There was a pause on the other end, and then she said, "You know how Maureen is. Just try not to rock the boat, sweetheart. You're both hormonal right now." Both hormonal, me and my mother-in-law. Because we were the problem. My father got on the line and said that the first weeks were always an adjustment, and that I shouldn't be making demands of people when they were trying to help. I almost laughed. Almost I said goodbye. I sat on the edge of their bathtub for a long time, James asleep in the little travel bassinet they'd set up in the guest room. I could hear the TV through the walls. Gordon's news program, the clink of dishes being washed, life carrying on as though nothing was different at all. And I thought, the deeper I look at this situation, the more I can see that something is very wrong, and everyone around me is working very hard to make sure I don't look too closely. My grandfather called me the next morning. Not my father. My grandfather, my dad's father, who everyone called Pop, who was 74, and still drove himself to the grocery store and did the crossword every day with a blue pen because he didn't believe in pencils. He'd heard from my dad that I'd had the baby. Dad hadn't thought to tell him I was struggling. Pop just knew. He always knew. He said, "Where are you right now?" I told him. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "You stay right there. I'm coming to see you." I told him it was 45 minutes from his apartment in Hamilton. He said, "Paige, I'm 74. Not dead." He arrived at 11 that morning, with a bag of groceries and a coffee from Tim Hortons and he sat down across from me at the kitchen table, while Maureen hovered in the doorway and introduced himself to her with the easy warmth of a man who has never once in his life needed anyone's approval. She offered to make tea. He said he had coffee, thank you. She didn't know what to do with that, so she left. He held James for a long time without saying much, just held him, and then he looked at me and said, "Tell me everything." So I did. I told him about the nights Noah wasn't home. About the way Maureen had started making decisions I hadn't agreed to. About how every time I tried to raise something with Noah, it became a conversation about my anxiety, or my hormones, or my tendency to catastrophize. About how I had this feeling, this persistent, nauseating feeling, that I was being managed. Pop listened without interrupting. That's a rarer thing than people understand. When I finished, he said, "Has anyone talked to you about your grandmother's estate?" I blinked. My grandmother, his wife, my father's mother, had passed away 14 months earlier. She'd left behind a small but meaningful estate. A house in Dundas, some savings, a few pieces of property she'd accumulated over the years. I was her only grandchild. She had spoken to me, in the months before she died, about what she wanted to leave me. It was private between us, and I had held it privately. I told Pop that no one had mentioned it. He set his coffee down, very carefully. "Noah's family knows about it," he said. "I don't know how, but they do. Your father mentioned it to Gordon at Christmas." Passing conversation, he didn't think anything of it, but I've been watching some things since then. I asked him what things. He said, "Your father and Gordon have been spending time together, more than usual. Your dad needed some money last year. You know the situation with his business. Gordon helped him out." He paused. "I'm not saying I know exactly what's been arranged. I'm saying I think you need to know that conversations have been happening without you." I sat with that for a moment, turned it over. I thought about the way my mother had told me not to rock the boat. The way my father had called me demanding. The way Maureen had moved me into her house without asking, put me somewhere she could watch me, somewhere I couldn't make any decisions without going through her first. I thought about the documents Noah had asked me to sign 3 weeks before I gave birth. Insurance papers, he'd said. Standard stuff, he'd said. I'd been exhausted and I'd trusted him and I'd signed. I asked Pop if he knew a lawyer. He said, "I know a good one." Her name was Wendy Tran and she had an office in downtown Hamilton and she wore reading glasses on a chain and she did not waste words. I liked her immediately. I brought the documents Noah had given me. I brought everything I could access. Our joint accounts, the paperwork from our mortgage, anything I'd kept copies of. Wendy looked through them for a long time while I sat across from her with James in a carrier on my chest. Then she looked up over her glasses and said, "Do you know what a power of attorney is?" I said yes. She said, "You signed one." The document Noah had called insurance paperwork was a limited power of attorney. It gave him the authority to make financial decisions on my behalf, including under certain conditions the ability to act on matters related to my inheritance. He had explained none of this to me. I remember the room going very quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight. I asked Wendy what that meant in practice. She explained that on its own, it didn't necessarily mean anything criminal had happened. But it was worth looking at the full picture, especially, she said, given what I told her about the timing. About the fact that my grandmother's estate was still in the process of being settled. About the fact that my father, one of the executors, had a financial relationship with my in-laws that I hadn't known about until 4 days ago. She told me not to sign anything else. She told me to document everything. And she said, in a voice that was very calm and very careful, "Paige, I want you to understand that what I'm describing is a possibility, not a certainty. But I think you deserve to know what you might be looking at." I drove back to Maureen's house, with my son asleep in his car seat, and I sat in their driveway for a long time. I thought about my grandmother, the way she'd held my hands across the table when she told me about the estate. She'd said, "This is yours, Paige, for your life, for your children. Don't let anyone tell you differently." She'd looked at me very directly when she said it, like she was trying to give me something I didn't know yet that I'd need. The next 2 weeks were the longest of my life. I stayed in Maureen and Gordon's house because I had nowhere else to go, and because leaving would have meant showing my hand before I was ready. I learned how to be invisible. I went to bed early. I answered questions simply. I let Maureen believe that I was tired and overwhelmed since settling in. I let her think she was winning. Meanwhile, Pop came every second day with coffee and updates from Wendy. What they'd found was this. My father had borrowed money from Gordon, a significant amount, close to $40,000. With a verbal agreement that it would be repaid once my grandmother's estate cleared. The estate, which my grandmother had specifically designated to go to me, was the collateral. My father had essentially promised someone else's money without telling anyone, including me. The power of attorney Noah had gotten me to sign was the mechanism. If Noah had authority over my financial decisions, he could, under certain conditions, work with my father to redirect the estate disbursement. They hadn't done it yet. But everything was in place for it to happen. Wendy filed an emergency revocation of the power of attorney. It went through in 3 days. Then she contacted the estate solicitor handling my grandmother's affairs and flagged a conflict of interest. My father was removed as an executor. I did not tell Noah any of this was happening. The night Wendy called to confirm the revocation had gone through, I sat in the guest room with James and I cried for a long time. Not sad crying, not relieved crying. It was something I don't quite have a word for. The kind of release that comes when you've been holding yourself together so tightly for so long that the moment it's even slightly safe to breathe, everything just lets go. Pop texted me that night. She would be proud. I knew exactly who he meant. 3 days later I told Noah. I didn't plan a speech. I wasn't dramatic about it. I waited until Maureen and Gordon had gone out for the evening, and I came downstairs and sat across from him at the kitchen table and I told him what I knew. He denied it at first. Said I'd misunderstood the documents. Said Wendy was making things up, creating problems, that this was exactly the kind of paranoid thinking that had been worrying him about me since the pregnancy. I watched him say all of this. I watched him very carefully. Then I told him the revocation was already filed. That Wendy had already spoken to the estate solicitor. That my father had already received a letter. He stopped talking. The silence that followed was very different from the silence in Wendy's office. This one was thin and brittle, like the moment before something breaks. He said, "How much do you know?" I said enough. He didn't say anything else. He got up and went upstairs and he called someone. I could hear the low, urgent murmur of his voice through the ceiling. And I sat there at that table and I held my son and I thought, this is what it feels like to finally see clearly. The fallout came the way these things always do, not all at once but in pieces. My father called, furious, saying I had humiliated him. Saying that I'd gone behind his back, that family didn't do this to family, that I owed Gordon and Maureen more loyalty than this. I let him talk. When he finished, I said, "You were going to take Grandma's money." Money she meant for James. He didn't have an answer for that. My mother called later, softer, more careful. She said my father was under a lot of stress, that things weren't black and white, that I needed to think about what I was doing to the family by pushing this. I thought about my grandmother looking at me across the table. "Don't let anyone tell you differently," I said. "Mom, I love you, but I'm not going to let this go." Maureen cornered me the next morning in the kitchen. She was controlled, measured, the way she always was, but her eyes were cold in a way I hadn't quite let myself see before. She said that I had created unnecessary conflict, that Noah had only been trying to protect the family's interests, that I was new to managing a significant inheritance, and it was reasonable that people wanted to help me make good decisions. I said, "He forged my intention, not my signature. He made me think I was signing something routine." She said, "You should have been more careful about what you signed." I looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had driven me from the hospital, who had brought me into her home and kept me there, within reach, where I couldn't make any moves she didn't know about. I said, "I'm going home." I took James and I called a cab, and I left. The separation from Noah came quickly after that. Wendy referred me to a family law attorney, a woman named, well, I've kept her name private, she knows who she is. We filed within 6 weeks of James coming home. Noah contested nothing about the custody arrangement, ultimately. I think he understood by then that anything that went to court was going to require documentation, and documentation was not going to help him. The estate settled 4 months later. The house in Dundas came to me. The savings came to me. It was not a fortune, but it was a foundation, a real one. My grandmother had built it over 40 years of careful, quiet decisions, and she had wanted me to have it, and now I did. My father repaid Gordon from his own line of credit. I had nothing to do with that arrangement, and I wanted nothing to do with it. Whatever happened between them was between them. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Hamilton, 20 minutes from Pop. I painted James's room a soft yellow-green, the color of new leaves, because it was the color I'd always imagined for a nursery, and nobody was around to tell me it was wrong. Pop came over every Sunday morning with bagels and the crossword. He always sat at the kitchen table and did the puzzle in blue pen while James slept in the next room, and we talked about nothing important. The weather, the Leafs, the neighbors, the price of groceries. The ordinary things. I had a therapy appointment every other Thursday. I was honest about everything, even the parts that made me look bad. The ways I had let things go. The times I had called myself oversensitive when I should have trusted myself. The years I had spent making myself smaller to fit into spaces that were never designed to hold me. I am still working on all of that. What I know now, and what I want to say clearly to anyone who needs to hear it. You are allowed to look closely at what's happening around you. You are allowed to ask questions. You are allowed to call a lawyer and revoke a document, and leave a house where you are not safe. You are allowed to do all of this even when the people telling you not to are the people you love. Family doesn't mean unlimited access to you. It doesn't mean the right to your silence. James is 14 months old now. He pulls himself up on the coffee table and gives me this look, this full-body, whole-face look of delight that I could not have imagined before he existed. Pop says he has my grandmother's eyes. I think he might be right. She never got to meet him, but she put something in place that made sure he would have a steady life. And somehow, the way these things sometimes work, that turned out to matter more than anyone knew it would. I don't have a clean ending to offer you. The anger I felt is still there sometimes, sitting quietly in the back of things. Some days I miss the family I thought I had. Some days I'm just grateful I found out the truth before it was too late to do anything about it. But most days, I sit in my yellow-green apartment in Hamilton, and James is babbling at the dog across the hall, and Pop is arguing with the crossword in blue pen, and it's quiet in the way that only feels possible when you're not waiting for something to go wrong. That kind of quiet, I've learned, is the whole point.